Chapter 2. The year after, one evening at the end of the Yuletide festival, Kristin Lavransdatter and Orm Erlandson came, quite unlooked-for guests, to Master Gunnulf's house in the city. It had blown and sleeted the whole day since before noon, and now in the late evening a heavy snowstorm had come on. The two were thick with snow when they came into the room where the priest sat at the supper board with his household. Gunnulf asked in some fear whether there was aught amiss at home on the manor. But Kristin shook her head. Erland was away from home at a feast in Gelman, she answered, when the priest questioned. But she had been so tired she could not go with him. The priest thought how she had now ridden all the way into the city. Her horse and Orm's were quite worn out. The last of the way they had scarce had strength to struggle through the snowdrifts. Gunnulf sent the two women of his household with Kristin. They were to get dry garments for her. They were his foster mother and her sister. Other women there were none in the priest's house. He himself cared for his brother's son. Meantime Orm was speaking. "Kristin is sick, I think. I said it to father, but he grew angry." "She had been quite unlike herself in these last days," said the boy. He knew not what it was. He could not remember whether 'twas she or himself that had first thought of coming hither. Oh yes, 'twas she that had first spoken of how much she longed to come into Christ's church, and he had said that if that was so, he would go with her. So this morning, straight away after his father had ridden off, Kristin had said that now they would go. Orm had let her have her way, though he saw the weather was threatening. But he didn't like the look in her eyes. Gunnulf thought that neither did he like it when Kristin now came in. Sorely thin she looked in Ingrid's black habit. Her face was wan as bast, and her eyes were sunken, with blue-black rings beneath them. Their glance was dark and strange. It was more than 3 months since he had seen her, when he was at Huseby for the christening feast. She had looked well then, as she lay in state in her bed, and she had said that she felt quite strong. It had been an easy delivery. So he had spoken against it when Ranfrid Ivarsdatter and Erland would have had the child given to a foster mother, while Kristin wept and begged that she might nurse Bjorgulf herself. The second son was called after Lavrans' father. The priest asked, therefore, first after Bjorgulf, for he knew too that Kristin had not liked the nurse they gave the child to. But she said that he was thriving well, and Frida was fond of him, and tended him much better than any could have deemed she would. "And Nicholas?" asked the uncle. "Was he as bonny as ever?" A little smile came to the mother's face. Nakvi grew comelier and comelier every day. No, he spoke not much, but else he was ahead of his age in every wise, and so big. No one would believe he was but in his second winter. Lady Gunnar said so too. Then she sat lost again. Master Gunnulf looked at the two, his brother's wife and his brother's son, sitting one on each side of him. They looked so weary and sorrowful, he grew sad at heart to see them. Orm, indeed, seemed ever heavy of mood. The boy was 15 years old now. He would have been the comeliest of youths had he not looked so weak and ailing. He was well nigh as tall as his father, but his form was all too slender and narrow of shoulder. In face, too, he favoured Erland, but his eyes were a much darker blue, and the mouth under its first short black down was yet smaller and softer than his father's, and ever, when it was closed, a sad little furrow showed at its corners. Even Orm's narrow brown neck under his black curled hair looked strangely unhappy as he sat, stooping a little over his food. Kristin had not sat at the board with her brother-in-law before in his own hall. The year before, she had been with Erland in the city at the springtide thing, and then they had lodged in this house which Gunnulf had had from his father, but the priest himself had lived then in the house of the Crossed Friars, as vicar for one of the canons. Now was Master Gunnulf parish priest of Stein, but he kept a chaplain in his charge, and himself oversaw the work of engrossing books for the churches of the archbishopric, while the precentor Eric Vinson was sick. Thus he lived for the time in his own house. The hall was unlike the rooms Kristin was used to see. 'Twas a timber house, but in the midst of the eastern gable wall Gunnulf had built a great stone fireplace, such as he had seen in the Southlands. A log fire burned between cast-iron dogs. The table stood along one of the long walls, and by the wall over against it were benches with writing desks. Before a picture of Mary Virgin burned a lamp of yellow metal, and nearby stood frames filled with books. Strange seemed the room to her, and strange her brother-in-law. Now she saw him sitting here at his board with his household, clerks and serving men, with a strange half-priestly look. There were some poor folk too, old men and a young boy with film-like thin red eyelids clinging tightly over the empty sockets. On the women's bench, with the 2 old women servants, sat a girl with a 2-year child in her lap. She swallowed down the meat hungrily and stuffed the child's mouth full to bursting. So it was that all the priests of Christ's Church fed the poor at eventide. But Kristin had heard that to Gunnulf Nicholson came fewer beggars than to the other priests, although, or because, he made them sit with him in his own hall and welcomed every beggar as an honoured guest. They were given food from his own dish and drink from the priest's own casks. Therefore they came hither when they felt the need of a meat meal, but else they would rather go to the other priests, where they were given porridge and small ale in the kitchen. As soon as the scribe had said grace after meat, the poor folk made ready to depart. Gunnulf talked kindly to each one, asked if they would not lodge here for the night, or whether there was anything else they desired. But only the blind boy stayed. The girl with the child in especial the priest asked to stay, and not take the little one out into the night. But she muttered an excuse and hastened out. Gunnulf bade a serving man see to it that blind Arnstein was given ale and a good bed in the guest-house. Then he rose and cast a hooded cloak about him. "You are weary, I think, Orm and Kristin, and would go to rest. Aldhild will see to you. Perhaps you will be asleep when I come home from the church." But Kristin begged that she might go with him. "'Tis for that I am come hither," she said, fixing desperate eyes on Gunnulf. He bade Ingrid lend her a dry cloak, and she and Orm went with the little company that followed him from the house. The ringing of the bells sounded as though they were right above their heads in the black night sky. The church was not many paces off. They dragged heavily through deep, wet, new-fallen snow. The weather was still now. Now and then single flakes of snow still floated down, shining faintly in the dark. In deadly weariness, Kristin tried to lean against the pillar she stood beside, but the stone chilled her through. She stood in the dark church and looked up toward the lights of the choir. She could not see Gunnulf up there, but she knew he sat there amidst the priests with his taper by his book. No, after all, she was sure she could not speak to him. Tonight it seemed as though there could be no help found for her anywhere. Sira Eilif at home reproved her that she took her everyday sins so hardly. She said 'twas the lure of spiritual pride. Let her just be diligent in prayer and good works, and she would have no time to brood over such things. The devil is no such fool as not to see then that your soul must needs escape him at last, and he will no longer care to tempt you so much. Oh no, 'twas like the devil was none so sure that he must lose her soul. But when she had lain here before, crushed by sorrow for her sins, for the hardness of her heart, her unclean life, and her soul's blindness, then had she felt that the sainted King had taken her in beneath the sheltering hem of his cloak. She had felt the clasp of his strong, warm hand on hers. He had pointed out to her the light that is the source of all strength and holiness. St. Olaf had turned her eyes towards Christ upon his cross. See, Kristin, God's loving kindness. Yes, she had begun to understand God's long-suffering love. But since then she had turned her again from the light and shut her heart against it, and now there was nothing else in her soul but disquiet and wrath and fear. Wretched, wretched was she. She had seen it for herself. Such a woman as she was had need of hard trials before she could be healed of her unloving spirit. And yet so rebellious was she that it seemed her heart must break under the trials that had been laid upon her. They were but small trials, but they were so many, and she so rebellious. She had a glimpse of her stepson's tall, slender form over on the men's side. She could not help herself. Orm she loved like a child of her own, but 'twas not possible for her to grow to love Margaret. She had striven and tried to force herself to like the child ever since the day last winter when Ulf Halderson had brought her home to Huseby. She deemed herself it was a fearful thing. Could she feel such misliking and wrath toward a little maid of only 9 years old? And well she knew that in part it was that the child was so strangely like her mother. Kristin didn't understand Erland. He showed nothing but pride that his little brown-eyed daughter was so fair. Never did the child seem to wake discomforting memories in her father. 'Twas as though Erland had forgotten all that concerned these children's mother. But it was not only because Margaret favoured her mother that Kristin misliked her. Margaret would not endure to be taught by any. She was haughty and harsh to the serving folk. Untruthful she was, too, and with her father a flatterer. She loved him not, as did Orm. It was ever to gain something that she clung to Erland with kisses and caresses. And Erland poured out gifts upon her, and humoured all the little maid's whims. Orm didn't like his sister either. She had seen that. It was a pain to her to feel herself so hard and cruel that she could not look on at Margaret's doing without anger and harsh judgment. But 'twas much more pain to see and hear the endless bickerings between Erland and his eldest son. The pain was the keener because she saw that Erland in his inmost heart had a boundless love for the boy, and he was unjust and rough towards Orm because he was at his wits' end to know what he should do with his son, or how he could make his future sure. He had given his bastard children lands and goods, but it seemed unthinkable that Orm could ever make a farmer. And Erland grew desperate when he saw how weak and sinewless Orm was. He would call his son rotten, strive fiercely to harden him, practise him hour after hour in the use of heavy weapons that 'twas impossible the boy could wield, force him to drink himself sick in the evenings, and bring him back half dead from perilous and toilsome hunting. Beneath all this, Kristin could see the anguish of Erland's heart. He was wild with sorrow often. She saw that this fine-grained and comely son of his was fit for but one place, and from that his birth barred him completely. And thus had Kristin come to understand how little patience Erland had when he must fear for one that was dear to him or feel pity for him. She saw that Orm understood it too, and she saw that the youth's heart was torn between love of his father and pride in him, and scorn for the man's unreason when Erland made his child suffer because troubles lay before them for which he and not the boy was to blame. But Orm had drawn close to his young stepmother. It was as though with her he breathed freely and felt lighter of mood. When he was alone with her, he would jest and laugh by times, in his still fashion. But Erland didn't like this. It was as though he misdoubted that these two might sit in judgment on his doings. Oh no, 'twas no easy lot for Erland. No marvel that he was angry and hasty in all that touched the two children. And yet, she winced with pain still when she thought of it. They had had the manor full of guests the week before. Now, when Margaret came home, Erland had had the loft at the lower end of the hall, over the outer room and the closet, set in order for a sleeping room. It should be her maiden bower, he said, and there she slept, with the maid whom her father had set to tend and serve her. Frida slept there too, with Björgulf. But now, in this press of Yuletide guests, Kristin had made this loft a sleeping room for the young men, and the two maids and the babe must sleep in the serving women's house. But since she had thought Erland would maybe not like she should send Margaret to sleep with the serving folk, she had made up a bed for her on one of the benches in the hall, where the ladies and maidens were sleeping. Margaret was ever loath to rise in the mornings. That morning Kristin had waked her many times, but she had turned over again and still lay sleeping after all the others were up. Kristin must needs have the hall cleared and made ready. The guests must have their morning meal, and at length she quite lost her patience. She pulled the down pillows from under Margaret's head and took away the coverings from above her. But when she saw the child lying there naked on the fur rug, she threw over her the cloak from her own shoulders. It was a piece of plain undyed wadmal. She wore it only when she went to and from the kitchen and storehouses to see to the service of the food. Erland came in at that moment. He had slept in one of the store lofts with some other men, for Lady Gunnar lay with Kristin in the great bed. When he saw what was happening, he fallen into a fury. He had grasped Kristin by the arm so hard that the marks of his fingers still showed on her flesh. "Do you think it is fit that this daughter of mine should lie in straw and wadmal? Margaret is mine, do you see, even though she's not yours. If it's not good enough for your own children, it is not good enough for her. But since you have held up the innocent little maid to scorn before these women, you must even make it good again before their eyes. Cover her over again with what you took off her." True it was that Erland had drunk heavily the night before, and when that was so, he was ever fretful next morning. And he might well have thought that there was talk among the women when she saw Elene's children. And he was thin-skinned and saw in all that touched the esteem they were held in. And yet, she had tried to speak of it with Sira Eilif, but here he could not help her. Gunnulf had said the sins she had confessed and done penance for, before Eilif Sirkson came to be her father-confessor, she need not name to him unless she saw that he must know them, in order that he might judge and counsel in her concerns. So there was much she had never told him, though she felt herself that thus she had come to seem, in Sira Eilif's eyes, a better woman than she was. But it was so comforting for her to have the friendship of this good and pure-hearted man. Erland mocked, but she had so much comfort from Sira Eilif. With him she could talk as much as she would of her children. All the little things she had wearied Erland to death with, the priest was ready to talk over with her. He had a way with little children, and good skill in their little troubles and sicknesses. Erland laughed at her when she went herself to the kitchen and cooked dainty dishes to send to the priest's house, for Sira Eilif was fond of good food and drink, and it pleased her to busy herself with such things and try her hand with what she had learnt from her mother or seen in the cloister. Erland didn't care what he ate, if one but let him have flesh meat at all times, when 'twas not a fast. But Sira Eilif came and talked and thanked her, and praised her skill when she had sent him a spitful of young ptarmigans in wrappings of fine bacon, or a dish of reindeer's tongues in French wine and honey. And he counselled her with her garden, and from Olaf's cloister, where the prior was his good friend. And then he read to her, and he could tell her so many fair things of the life out in the great world. But for the very reason that he was so good and so simple-hearted a man, it was often hard to speak to him of the evil she saw in her own heart. When she confessed to him how angry she had been with Erland for his behaviour in this matter of Margaret, he had enjoined on her duty to bear with her husband. But he seemed to think it was Erland alone that had offended in speaking so unjustly to his wife, and in the hearing of strangers. And Kristin, indeed, thought the same. But in her inmost heart she felt that she shared in the guilt. She could not make this clear, but it troubled her heart sorely. Kristin looked up at the shrine, gleaming faintly golden up in the twilight behind the high altar. She had looked so surely that when she had stood here once more, something should again befall her, some deliverance of her spirit. Once again would a living spring well up in her heart and wash away all the unrest and fear and bitterness and doubt that filled it. But tonight there was no one that had patience with her. "Have you not learnt it once already, Kristin, to bring your self-righteousness forth into the light of God's righteousness, to hold up your heathenish and selfish desire in the light of love? 'Tis that you will not learn, Kristin." But when last she knelt there, she had had Narkvi in her arms. His little mouth against her breast sent such warmth into her heart that it grew even as soft wax, easy for the heavenly love to refashion. And still she had Narkvi. He ran about the hall at home, so fair and so sweet that her breast ached if she but thought of him. His soft curly hair began to darken now. He would be black-haired like his father. And he was so bursting with life and naughtiness. She made beasts for him out of old bits of fur rug, and he threw them away and ran after them, racing the young hounds. And 'twould often end with the bear falling into the hearth fire and burning up with much smoke and an evil smell, while Narkvi stood howling and jumping and stamping, and then buried his head in her lap. All his adventures ended there, as yet. The maids fought for his favour. The men caught hold of him and threw him up to the roof whenever they came into the hall. If the boy saw Ulf Haldarsson, he ran at once and clung to the man's leg. Ulf had taken him out into the farm place now and then. Erland snapped his fingers to his son and set him on his shoulder for a moment. But his father was the one person at Huseby that paid least heed to the boy, though he was fond of Narkvi. Erland was glad that he had 2 true-born sons now. The mother's heart turned in her. Björgulf they had taken from her. He whimpered now when she would have held him, and Frida put him straightway to her breast. The foster mother watched over the boy jealously. But the new child would never give away from her. They had said, Kristin's mother and Erland, that she must spare her strength now, and so they took her newborn son and gave him to another woman. And it was as though she had felt a vengeful joy at the thought that all that had come of this was that now she looked to have yet a 3rd child before Björgulf was full 11 months old. She dared not speak of it with Sire Eilif. He would maybe only think that she was vexed that already she must go through all this again. But it was not that. From her pilgrimage she had come home with a deep awe in her soul. Never more should this madness overmaster her. All summer through she had sat alone with her child down in the old hall, weighed in her mind the Archbishop's words and Gunnulf's sayings, being vigilant in prayer and penance, diligent in working to restore the neglected manor and to win her housefolk by kindness and thought for their welfare, eager to help and serve all around her so far as her hands and her power might reach. There had sunk over her a calm, delicious peace. She upheld herself with thoughts of her father, with prayers to the holy men and women Sire Eilif read of, and meditation on their courage and steadfastness. And with a tender heart, with happiness and thankfulness, she remembered Brother Edvin as he had appeared to her in the moonlight that night. She had understood full well his message, when he smiled so gently and hung his mitten on the beam of moonlight. Had she but faith enough, she could grow to be a good woman. When the first year of marriage was at an end, she had to remove back to her husband. She comforted herself when she felt herself unsure. The Archbishop himself had enjoined upon her that in the life in common with her husband she should show her new heart. And indeed she strove with an eager care for his welfare and his honour. Erland himself had said it. "It has come to pass after all, Kristin. You have brought back honour to Huseby." Folks showed her so much kindness and respect. All seemed willing to forget that she had begun her wedded life a little over hastily. Where housewives came together, she was taken into council. They praised her ordering of her home. She was fetched to be brideswoman and to be helper at births on the great manors. None made her feel that she was young and unskilled and a newcomer to the country. The serving folk sat on in the hall through the evening, even as at Jorengard. All had somewhat to ask their mistress of. It came over her in a glow of joy how kind folks were to her, and that Erland was proud of her. Then Erland had gone to work to take order for the ship levy from the harbours south of the fjord. He journeyed about the country, riding or sailing, and was busy with folk who came to him and letters that were to be sent off. He was so young and glad and comely. The sluggish, unjoyous air she had often seen upon him in former days seemed blown clean away from the man. He glittered new-wakened like the morning. He had little time to spare for her now, but she grew dizzy and wild when he came near her with his smiling face and his venture-loving eyes. She had laughed with him over the letter that had come from Munin Bardson. The knight had not been at the meeting of the king's men himself, but he scoffed at the whole affair, and most of all at Erling Vidkunsen's being made regent. It seemed, said Munin, his first task was to give himself new titles. He would have folk call him High Steward now, it was said. Munin wrote of her father too. The hill-wolf from Sill crept under a rock and sat mum. That is to say, your father-in-law took lodging with the priests of St. Laurentius Church and raised not his honeyed voice in the parleys. He had in his keeping letters under the seals of Sir Erngisel and Sir Carl Tureson. If they not be yet worn to shreds, then must the parchment be tougher than the devil's shoe soles. And this also you must know, that Lavrans gave 8 marks, pure silver, to Nonnesetter. Like enough, the man hath got it into his head that Kristin had not so wearisome a life there as of rights she should. She had indeed felt a pang of shame and pain, but yet she could not help laughing with Erland. The winter and spring had passed over her in a whirl of mirth and gladness. Now and then a storm on Orm's account. Erland knew not if he should take the boy north with him. It ended with an outburst at Eastertide. That night Erland wept in her arms. He dared not take his son aboard with him. He feared that Orm must needs come short in war. She had comforted him and herself and the lad. Maybe the boy would grow stronger as he grew in years. The day she rode down with Erland to the haven at Bergsea, she could not feel anything of fear or sorrow at his going. She was drunken, as it were, with him and his overflowing gladness. She had not known herself then that already she was with child again. She had thought when she felt sick, it was but with the bustle over Erland's going, with the unquiet times and drinking feasts at home, and that she was worn out with suckling Narkby. When she felt new life quicken within her, she had so looked forward to the winter, to going about in the city and countryside with her fair and gallant husband, while yet she too was fair and young. She was so sure that in his Russian warfare Erland would show he was fit for other things than wasting his name and fame and goods. She had thought to wean the boy in autumn. It was troublesome to take him and his nurse with her wherever she might go. And now, no, she had not been glad, and she had told this to Sira Eilif. Then had the priest rebuked her most sharply for her unloving and worldly spirit. And the whole summer she had passed striving to be glad and to thank God for the new child she was to bear, and for the good tidings that came to her of Erland's worthy deeds in the north. Then he came home just before Michaelmas, and she saw well that he was not over glad when he saw what was at hand. And that night he said it. I thought that when once you were mine, 'twould be like drinking Yuletide every day. But it looks as though most of the time will be long fasts. Each time she remembered it, a wave of blood flooded her face, as hotly as that evening when she had turned her back on him, darkly flushed and tearless. Erland had tried to make amends with love and kindness, but she could not forget it. The fire in her that not all her tears of penitence had had power to quench, nor her anguish for her sin to choke. It was as though Erland had trod it out with his foot when he said these words. Late at night, the service over, they sat before the chimney place in Gunnulf's hall, he and Kristin and Orm. A flagon of wine with some small goblets stood on the edge of the fireplace. Gunnulf had asked more than once if his guest would not go to rest now, but Kristin begged that she might sit on. "Do you remember, brother-in-law," she asked, "when I told you once that our priest at home counselled me to give myself to a cloister, should father not consent that Erland and I should wed?" Gunnulf glanced swiftly across at Orm, but Kristin said with a little sick smile, "Do you think this grown youth doesn't know that I am a weak and sinful woman?" Master Gunnulf answered softly, "Did you have a call to the life of the cloister then, Kristin?" "God might sure have opened my eyes when once I was come into his service." "Perhaps he deemed your eyes need to be opened to understand that you should be in his service wherever you are. Husband, children, housefolk at Huseby, they all surely have need that a trusty and patient serving woman of God go about among them and care for their welfare. Surely that maid weds best who chooses Christ to her bridegroom, and gives herself not into the power of any sinful man, but a child that had already sinned. I would have had you come to God, wearing your garland," whispered Kristin. "So did he say to me, Brother Edvin Rickardson, of whom I have often told you. Do you think the same?" Gunnulf Nicolausson nodded. Though many a woman has raised herself up out of a life of sin with such strength and steadfastness that we now may pray safely for her intercession. But this befell more often in days gone by, when she was threatened with torture and the stake and red-hot pincers if she avowed herself a Christian. I have oft times thought, Kristin, 'twas easier then to tear oneself free from the bonds of sin, when it could be done thus by might and main at a single wrench. Even though mankind is so corrupted, yet does courage still dwell by nature in many a breast. And 'tis courage that often drives on a soul to seek out God. And so 'tis like the tortures spurred on as many souls to steadfastness as they terrified to apostasy. But a young wildered child that is torn from the lusts of the flesh before she has learned to understand what they bring upon her soul, she is brought into sisterhood with holy maids, who have given themselves up to watch and pray for them that sleep outside in the world. "I wish it was summer," he said of a sudden, rising up. The two others looked up at him in wonder. "Yes, it came into my mind, the cuckoo's call from the hillsides at Huseby of a morning. Always we heard it first from the eastward in the hills behind the houses, and then an answer came from far off in the woods round by. It sounded so sweet across the lake in the morning stillness. Don't you think it is fair at Huseby, Kristin?" "East cuckoo is grief cuckoo," said Orm Erlandsson in a low voice. "Methinks Huseby is the fairest place in all the world." The priest laid his hands on his nephew's narrow shoulders for a moment. "So thought I too, kinsman," 'Twas my father's home too. The youngest son stands no nearer the heritage than do you, my Orm. When father lived with my mother, you were nearest heir, said the youth softly as before. We cannot help it, I and my children, Orm, said Kristin sorrowfully. I think you have seen that I bear you no grudge, he answered quietly. 'Tis such a wide, open countryside, said Kristin in a little. One sees so far around from Huseby, and the heaven is so wide. Where I am from, it lies like a roof right down upon the hilltops. The dale lies low in shelter, so hollow and green and fresh. The world is of so fit a size, not too great and not too narrow. She sighed and moved her hands in her lap. His home was there? The man your father would have wed you to? Asked the priest, and the woman nodded. Have you ever repented that you didn't wed him? He asked again, and she shook her head. Gunnulf crossed the room and took a book from the case. He sat down again by the fire, opened its clasps, and turned over the leaves. When Adam and his wife had defied the will of God, then they felt in their own flesh a power that defied their wills. God had created them, man and woman, young and fair, that they should live in wedlock and bring forth co-heirs with themselves of his bounteous gifts, the loveliness of the garden of paradise, the fruit of the tree of life and bliss everlasting. They needed not to feel shame of their bodies, for as long as they obeyed God, their whole body and all their limbs were in the power of their will, even as are hand and foot. Flushing red as blood, Kristin pressed her hands crosswise under her breast. The priest bent towards her a little. She felt his strong yellow eyes on her bowed face. Eve made spoil of that which belonged to God, and her husband received it when she gave him that which by right was the possession of their Father and Creator. They would fain have made themselves his like. Now they marked that they were like unto him first in this. As they had betrayed his lordship in the great world, so now was their lordship over the little world, the soul's house of flesh, betrayed. As they had played false to the Lord their God, so now would the body play false to its Lord, the soul. Then did these bodies seem to them so ugly and hateful that they made garments to hide them. First but a short apron of fig leaves. But as they came to know more and more the inwardness of their own fleshly nature, they drew the garments up higher and higher, over the place of their hearts and over their backs, so unwilling to bow. Until these last days, when men clothe themselves in steel to the outermost joints of fingers and toes, and hide their faces behind the bars of the helm, so are strife and treachery spread abroad in the world. "Help me, Gunnulf," prayed Kristin. She was white to the lips. I don't know my own will." "Say, then, thy will be done," answered the priest softly. "You know that his will is that you should open your heart to his love, and that then you must love him again with all your soul's might." Kristin turned suddenly towards her brother-in-law. "You don't know how dearly I loved Erland and my children." "My sister, all other love is but as an image of heaven in the water puddles of a muddy road. You will get muddy if you dabble in them, but if you bear ever in mind that 'tis a mirroring of the light from yonder other home, then you will rejoice in its fairness, and will take good heed not to destroy it by stirring up the mud beneath." "Aye, but you are a priest. You have vowed to God to fly these temptations." "So have you, Kristin. when you promised to forsake the devil and all his works. The devil's work is that which begins in sweet desire and ends in them that work it stinging and biting each other like toad and asp. 'Twas that Eve learnt, that when she would have given her husband and her offspring that which was God's possession, then she brought them nothing but outlawry and blood-guiltiness and death, that came into the world when brother slew brother on that first small field where thorns and thistles grew on the stone heaps between the little plots. "Aye, but you are a priest," she said as before. "You don't have to strive every day to agree with another in your will." She burst into tears. "To be patient." The priest said with a little smile, "In that matter there is strife between soul and body in each mother's son. Therefore are bride mass and wedlock appointed, that man and woman shall find help to live, wedded pair and parents and children and housemates, as trusty and helpful travelling companions on the journey toward the home of peace." Kristin said low, "I think it must be easier to watch and pray for them that sleep outside in the world than to strive against one's own sins." "It is so," said the priest sharply. "But do you think, Kristin, there has lived one holy man that hath not had to defend himself against the enemy, at the same time as he strove to guard the lambs against the wolf?" Kristin said low and timidly, I had thought, they that move from holy place to holy place, and have command of all prayers and words of power." Gunnulf leaned forward, mended the fire, and remained sitting with his elbows on his knees. "It was 6 years ago, about this time of year, that we came to Rome, Aleph and I, and 2 Scots priests that we had come to know in Avignon. We had gone on foot the whole way. We came to the city just before the fast. At that time the folk in the Southlands hold great feastings and banquets. They call it Carnivale. Then does wine, both red and white, run like rivers in the tavern houses, and folks dance at night outside, and have torches and bonfires in the open places. It is spring in Italia then, and the flowers are blooming in meadows and gardens, and the women deck themselves with these, and throw roses and violets to passers-by in the streets. They sit up in the windows, and they have carpets of silk and gold brocade hanging from the sills down over the wall-stones. For all the houses are of stone down there, and the knights have their castles and strong places in the midst of the cities. I think there is no town law or market peace in that city, for they and their serving men fight in the streets till the blood runs down. There stood such a castle in the street where we dwelt, and the lord who ruled there was named Hermes Malavolti. It shadowed all the narrow lane where we lodged, and our chamber was as dark and cold as a dungeon in a stone fortress. Often, when we went out, we had to press close to the wall while he rode by, with silver bells on his garments, and a whole troop of armed followers, while filth and rottenness splashed up from the horses' hoofs. For in that land the people do but cast all filth and sweepings outside their doors. The streets are cold and dark and straight as rock cliffs, quite unlike the green roadways of our towns. In those streets they hold races when the time of Carnivale comes. They send out wild Arab horses to race against each other. The priest paused a little. Then he went on. This Sir Hermes had a kinswoman dwelling in his house. Isotta was her name, and she might well have been Iseult the Fair herself. Her skin and hair were of the hue of honey, but her eyes, I think, were black. I saw her time and again at a window. But outside the city the land is more waste than the most desolate uplands in our land, where nothing haunts but wolf and reindeer and the eagle screams. Yet there are towns and castles in the mountains round about, and out on the green uplands a man can see everywhere marks of folk who must have dwelt there in days gone by. And great flocks of sheep and herds of white oxen are grazing. Herdsmen armed with long spears follow them about on horseback, and these are perilous folk for wayfarers to meet, for they murder and rob them and cast their bodies into holes in the earth. But out upon these green plains lie the churches of pilgrimage." Master Gunnulf was silent for a while. Then he said, "Perhaps that land seems so unspeakably desolate because the city lies in the midst of it, she that was queen over all the heathen world and was chosen to be the bride of Christ. For now the watchmen have forsaken the city, and in the whirl of feasting and riot, the town seems like a forsaken spouse. Ribalds have set up their abode in the castle, where the husband is not at home, and they have lured the lady on to wanton with them in their lust and strife and bloodshed. But under the earth are treasures, dearer than all the treasures the sun shines upon. There are the graves of the holy martyrs, hewn out of the living rock beneath, and there are so many that a man grows dizzy but to think of it. When one calls to mind how many they are, the torture witnesses that here have suffered death for the cause of Christ, one might think that each grain of dust that whirls up from the hoofs of the ribald's horses must be holy and worthy of worship." The priest drew a thin chain out from under his clothing and opened the little silver cross that hung from it. Within was something black that looked like tinder and a little green bone. Once we had been down in these passages all the day, and we had said our prayers in caves and oratories, where the first disciples of St. Peter and St. Paul had met together to hold Mass. Then the monks who owned the church where we went down gave us these holy relics. 'Tis a little piece of such a sponge as the holy maids used to wipe up the blood of the martyrs, that it might not be lost, and a knuckle of a finger joint of a holy man whose name God alone knows. Then did we four promise one another that we would every day call upon this Holy One whose honour is unknown to men, and we took this nameless martyr to witness that we should never forget how quite unworthy we were to be rewarded of God and honoured of men, and we would ever remember that nothing in the world is worthy to be desired, save only his mercy." Kristin kissed the cross reverently and gave it to Orm, who did the same. Then Gunnulf said suddenly, "I will give you this holy relic, kinsman." Orm knelt on one knee and kissed his uncle's hand. Gunnulf hung the cross about the youth's neck. "Would you like to see these places, Orm?" The boy's face lightened up in a smile. "Yes, and I know now that some day I shall come thither." "Have you never had a mind to be a priest?" asked Gunnulf. "Yes," answered the boy, "when father has cursed these weak arms of mine. But I don't know if he would like that I should be a priest. And then there is that you know of," he said softly. "For your birth a dispensation could be had, I think," said the priest quietly. "Maybe, Orm, some day we might journey southward together, you and I." "Tell us more, uncle," prayed Orm softly. "Aye, that will I." Gunnulf clasped the arms of the chair with his hands and looked into the fire. While I wandered there, seeing nothing else but memorials of the blood witnesses, and remembered the unbearable torments they had endured for Jesu's name's sake, there came upon me a sore temptation. I thought of how the Lord had hung nailed to the cross those 6 hours. But his witnesses had been tormented with unutterable tortures for many days. Women saw their children tortured to death before their eyes. Young tender maids had their flesh torn from their bones with iron combs. Young boys were driven on the claws of wild beasts and the horns of mad oxen. Then seemed it to me as though many of these had borne more than Christ himself. I brooded over this till I thought that my heart and my brain must break in sunder. But at last the light I had begged and prayed for came to me, and I understood that as these had suffered, so ought we have strength to suffer. Who would be so foolish that he would not willingly endure pains and torment, when this was the path that led to a faithful and steadfast bridegroom who waits with arms stretched out and breast bloody and burning with love? For he loved mankind, and therefore did he die, as the bridegroom who hath gone forth to save his bride from the hands of robbers. And they bind him and torment him unto death, while he sees his dearest love sit feasting with his slayers, jesting with them and mocking his torments and his faithful love. Gunnulf Nicolausson buried his face in his hands. Then did I understand that this mighty love upholdeth all things in the world, even the fires of hell. For if God would, he could take the soul by force. We would be strengthless motes in his hand. But he loves us as the bridegroom loves his bride, who will not force her, but if she yield not to him willingly, must suffer that she flee him and shun him. But I have thought, too, that perhaps no soul can yet be lost to all eternity. For every soul must desire this love, I think, but it seems so dear a purchase to give up all other delights for its sake. But when the fire hath burned away all stiff-necked and rebellious will, then at last shall the will to God, were it no greater in a man than a single nail in a whole house, remain in the soul unconsumed, as the iron nail is left in the ashes of a house burnt down. Gunnulf, Kristin half arose. I am afraid. Gunnulf looked up with white face and flaming eyes. I too was afraid, for I understood that this torment of God's love can have no end, so long as man and maid are born upon this earth, and he must be fearful that he may lose their souls, so long as he daily and hourly giveth his body and his blood on 1,000 altars, and there are men who scorn the offering. And I was afraid to think of myself, that unclean had served at his altar, said mass with unclean lips, and lifted him with unclean hands. And I thought I was even as the man who had brought his beloved to a house of shame, and betrayed her. He caught Kristin in his arms as she sank down, and he and Orm bore the swooning woman over to the bed. In a little she opened her eyes, sat upright, and covered her face with her hands. She burst into a wild, wailing weeping. I cannot, Gunnulf. When you speak, I see that I can never. Gunnulf took her hand, but she turned her head away from the man's wild, pale face. Kristin, you can never be content with any lesser love than the love that is between God and the soul. Kristin, look about you. See what the world is. You who have borne 2 children, have you never thought on this, that every child that is born is baptized in blood, and that every human being born into this world draws in with his first breath the scent of blood? Don't you think that you, who are a mother, should fix all your intent on this, that your sons fall not back to that first baptismal pact with the world, but hold fast to the other pact they made with God when made clean by the waters of the font? She sobbed and sobbed. I am afraid of you, she said again. Gunnulf, when you speak thus, I see well that I can never find my way to peace. God will find you, said the priest softly. Be still, and don't fly from him who hath sought after you before you were conceived in your mother's womb. He sat a while there by the bedside. Then he asked quietly and calmly if he might wake Ingrid and ask the woman to come and help her to undress. Kristin shook her head. Then he made the sign of the cross over her 3 times, and, bidding Orm good night, went into the closet where he slept. Orm and Kristin drew off their clothes. The boy seemed sunk in fathomless thoughts. When Kristin had lain down, He came across to her. He looked at her grey-flecked face and asked if she would have him sit by her till she slept. "Yes. Oh, no, Orm. You must be weary, you that are young. The night must be far spent." Orm stood yet a little while. "Does it not seem strange to you," he said of a sudden, "Father and my uncle Gunnulf? Unlike as they are to each other, yet they are alike too, after a fashion." Kristin lay a little, thinking. Yes, maybe so. They are unlike other men." Soon after she fell asleep, and Orm went over to the other bed. He stripped and crept in. There was a linen sheet below and linen covers on the pillows. The boy stretched himself out on the smooth, cool couch. His heart beat, thrilled with the thought of these new adventures whereto his uncle's words had shown the way. Prayers, fasts, all the observances he had practised because he had been taught to, all grew new of a sudden, weapons in a goodly warfare that he longed for. Maybe he would be a monk or a priest, if he could win dispensation for his birth in adultery. Gunnulf's couch was a wooden bench with a sheet of skin spread over a little straw, and a single small pillow, so that he was forced to lie stretched straight out. The priest took off his frock, lay down in his underclothes, and drew the thin coverlid of wadmal over him. The little lighted wick twined round an iron rod he left burning. His own words had left him crushed with unrest and fear. He was faint with yearning for that time gone by. Would he never again find that bridal gladness of heart that had filled his whole being that spring in Rome? It was when he had come back to Norway that strong disquietude took hold upon him. There was so much to disquiet him. There were his riches, the great inheritance from his fathers, and the rich benefice. There was the path that he could see lying before him, his place in the cathedral chapter. He knew that it was meant for him. If he forsook not all his possessions to go into the cloister of the preaching friars, take the vows and bow himself under the rule, this was the life he desired, but with but half a heart. And then, when he was old enough and hardened to the fight, there were men in Norway's realm that lived and died in utter heathendom, or led astray by the false doctrines that the Russians put forth under the name of Christendom. The Lapps and the other half-wild folks that he could never cease to think about. Was it not as though God had wakened in him this longing to fare forth to their land, bringing the word and the light? But he thrust the thought of this mission from him, on the plea that he must obey the Archbishop. Lord Eilif counselled him against it. Lord Eilif had hearkened to him and spoken with him, showing him clearly that he spoke as to the son of his old friend, Sir Nicolaus of Huseby. You that come of the line of old Skogheim Gaut's daughters can never keep you within measure, whether it is good or ill you have set your heart upon. The Lapp folk's salvation he had much at heart himself, he said, but they had no need of a teacher that wrote and spoke Latin as well as his mother tongue, and was learned in the law no less than in arithmetica or algorismus. Sure it was that he had been given learning that he might use it. And, to my mind, 'tis uncertain whether you have been granted the gift of speaking to the poor and simple peoples up north. But in that sweet spring his learning had seemed to him no more to be held in reverence than the learning every little maid gets from her mother, to spin and brew and bake and milk, the teaching every child needs that it may do its work in the world. Gunnulf stood up. On one end wall of the closet hung a great crucifix, and in front of it was a great flat stone upon the floor. He knelt down upon the stone and stretched his arms out sidewise. He had used his body to endure this posture, so that he could kneel thus by the hour, still as stone. With eyes fastened on the crucifix, he awaited the comfort that came to him when he could lose himself wholly in contemplation of the cross. But the first thought that came into his mind now was this: had he the will to part with this crucifix? St. Franciscus and his brethren had crosses that they joined together themselves out of branches of trees. He should give away this fair rood. To the church at Huseby he might give it. Peasants, children, and women that came thither to Mass, they might well be strengthened by feeding their eyes with such a visible picture of the Saviour's lovely mildness in his passion. Simple souls like Kristin. For himself, it should not be necessary. Night after night he had knelt with close-shut senses and limbs benumbed till he saw the vision. The hill with the 3 crosses against the sky. Yonder cross in the midst, which was destined to bear the Lord of earth and heaven, trembled and shook. It bent like a tree before the storm, affrighted that it should bear that all too precious burden, the sacrifice for the sins of all the world. The Lord of the tents of storm held it in, as the knight curbs his charger, the chief of the castle of heaven it bore to battle. Then was made manifest the wonder that was the key to deeper and ever deeper wonders. The blood that ran down the cross for the remission of all sins and the boot of all sorrows, that was the visible miracle. By this first wonder the soul's eye could be opened to behold the yet darker mysteries. God that descended into earth and became a son of a virgin and brother to mankind, that harried hell and stormed with his booty of souls set free up to the blinding sea of light, wherefrom the world hath issued and whereby the world is upholden. And towards those bottomless and eternal deeps of light his thoughts were drawn up, and there they passed into the light and vanished, as a flight of birds passes away into the glory of the evening sky. Gunnulf did not move until the church bell rang for matins. All was still when he passed through the hall. Kristin and Orm were still sleeping. Out in the pitch-dark yard the priest tarried a little, but none of his housefolk came to go with him into the church. He required not that they should go to worship more than twice in the day's round, but Ingrid, his foster-mother, well-nigh always bore him company to matins. This morning it seemed that she too slept. Aye, she had been up late the night before. All that day the 3 kinsfolk spoke but little together, and of nothing but small matters. Gunnulf looked weary, but he talked jestingly of this and that. "We were foolish yester evening. We sat there as sorrowful as 3 fatherless children," he said once, and told of some of the many merry little haps that befell here in Nidaros, with the pilgrims and such folk, which the priests jested over among themselves. An old man from Heyerdahl had had errands here for all the folks of his parish, and got the prayers all mingled together. Things would have looked but ill in the parish, it came into his head after, if St. Olaf had taken him at his word. Late in the evening Erland came in, dripping wet. He had sailed into the city, and it was blowing hard again. He was raging, and fell upon Orm at once with furious words. Gunnulf listened a while in silence, then, "When you speak so to Orm, Erland, you are like our father, as he used to be when he spoke to you." Erland went silent at once. Then he flung around. "Well, I know, so witlessly did I never bear myself when I was a boy. Make off from the manor, a sick woman and a whelp of a boy in a snowstorm. Else it is not much to brag of, Orm's manfulness. But you see, at least he doesn't fear his father." "You weren't afraid of your father either," said his brother, smiling. Orm stood up before his father, saying nothing and striving to seem careless. "Aye, you can go," said Erland. And then, I am quite sick of the whole affair at Huseby, but one thing I know. This summer shall Orm fare with me northward. Then, I think, we will lick this pet lamb of Kristin's into shape. He is not a bungler either, he went on eagerly to his brother. He shoots with a sure aim, and a coward he is not. But ever he is cross-grained and mopish, and 'tis as though he had no marrow to his bones. No, if you berate your son often, as you did but now, 'tis no marvel he will mope, said the priest. Erland changed his tone, laughing as he said, For that matter, I had often to suffer worse things from my father, and God knows that I mope not much for that. But let that be. Now I am come hither, let us even be merry for Yule, since Yule it is. Where is Kristin? What was it she had to speak of to you now again? I don't believe she had anything to speak with me, said the priest. She had set her heart on hearing Mass here at Yule. She might well make shift with those she hears at home, I think, said Erland. But 'tis pity of her, as things are going, all youth is being worn away from her. He struck one hand against the other. I see not how the Lord can think we have need of a new son every year. Gunnulf looked up at his brother. What? No, I don't know what our Lord may deem that you two need, but what Kristin needs most, I think, is that you be kind to her. Aye, like enough she does, said Erland in a low voice. The next morning Erland went to the day mass with his wife. They were bound for St. Gregory's Church. Erland heard Mass there always when he was in the city. The two walked alone, and down the street where the snow lay swept up into drifts, heavy and wet, Erland led his wife by the hand fairly and courteously. He had not said a word to her of her flight from home, and he had been friendly to Orm after the first storm. Kristin walked quiet and pale, with head a little bent. The long black fur cloak with the silver clasp seemed to weigh down her slight, thin body. "Would you that I should ride with you homeward, and let Orm sail with the boat?" said the man, to say something. "Maybe you would scarce care to cross the fjord." "No, you know that I do not like to go on boats." It was calm now, and the weather mild. Every moment a load of heavy, wet snow would fall from the trees. The skies hung low and dark grey above the white town. There was a greenish-grey, watery tinge on the snow, and the houses, timber walls and fences and tree trunks showed black in the damp air. Never, Kristin thought, had she seen the world look so cold and wan and faded.